So welcome to IdeaFest. A special welcome to members of the community who aren't UVic faculty or students here. So maybe could you show me by a round of applause how many people are here from the community? In other words, they're not students or faculty. Please give me a round of applause. That's fantastic. And for those of you from the UVic community, let's hear from you too. Where are you? All right. Well, great, thank you. Welcome to this panel on the refugee crisis and how the world has responded. The panel is sponsored by the Center for Global Studies, by the History Department, and by the BIG project. The BIG project is Borders and Globalization. And my name is John Lutz. I'm chair of the History Department. It's my honor to chair this panel. I'm at the stage in my career where people just keep asking me to chair. They don't want me to do anything else. They don't want me to talk or do anything. They just want me to chair. So I'm the chair. And I was the chair of a panel, or a couple of panels, on the same topic, actually, on how Canada was responding, or how we could respond, back in September and October, also sponsored by the same organizations. Could you put up your hand if you were at one of those sessions in the fall? So for those of you who are there, I wanted to say this. We passed the hat. I mean, if you remember September, October, the refugee crisis was just kind of fresh and new. So we passed the hat, wanting to help Syrian refugees. The group of you, in the two sessions, we raised $1,000. And the refugee family which you sponsored arrived here in Victoria last week. So that's really cool. So thank you very much. So today, I guess, perhaps in the question period, we'll talk a little bit more about what we can do, because the world has changed, obviously, since September, and the kinds of ways that we can respond and might want to think about responding has changed. So we'll hear our panelists, and then I'll facilitate discussion. Let me tell you about the format for this evening. So we have a series of speakers which I'm going to introduce. It's an unusual format, I think, in a couple respects. We're going to have the speakers speak, I think, in the order that they're sitting here. And they're each invited to speak for 10 minutes. And then I have a zinger question I have saved up for them. If I haven't actually figured out what they're going to say, I'm going to create a zinger question. And I'm going to, at the end of their 8 minutes, I'm going to give them a little pause, and I'm going to ask them a question, try and throw them off balance a little bit, and see how they respond, and give them another couple minutes to respond. We'll cycle through everybody like that, and then you'll have a chance to try and throw them off balance at the end. So also, I think after our second speaker, we're going to show a little video clip just to kind of remind us of the news footage and how to frame some of the later papers. So I think with a couple of other, I guess what we call bureaucratic details, you'll notice in front of you there are opinion pages for you to fill out, hopefully at the end of the evening. You'll notice, or we will circulate a sign-up sheet if you want to be kept in touch with the Center for Global Affairs and the activities of the Center. You'll be invited, or at least get an email notice about when the future activities will happen. And the other thing is we're videotaping this, and it'll be available online. And we're going to questions at the end, and there are mics. There's one fixed mic in the room, and there'll be a floating mic at that time. If you don't want to be videotaped, could you let our cameraman in the very back know by raising your hand now, you think is a good way to do that, or at the time? When they ask a question. Okay, when you ask a question, just kind of flag the cameraman and he will shut the camera off. He's back in the corner there. That's Sharong, I think, in the back. Is that right? It's not Sharong. Hunter's in the back today. So anyway, if you don't want to be videoed, kind of do something like this and he'll cut the camera off. So I'd like to introduce the speakers. I'm going to introduce them all at once right now, and you can sort of go through the order. So my colleague immediately on the left, Dr. Penny Bryden, is a professor of history in my department, at the History Department. Her work is focused on domestic Canadian politics, particularly in the period since the Second World War. She's examined the development of the welfare state and the evolution of intergovernmental relations in Canada. Recently, she's completed an overview of Canadian political history entitled Canada, a Political Biography, that'll come out in the fall by Oxford University Press. And she's going to talk on Canada, the Refugee Crisis in Historical Perspective. From here, we move over to Adel Guitouni, and Adel is Associate Professor of Management Sciences and Operations Management here at UVic. Since 2011, on behalf of the business school, he is actively engaged in several educational activities that support democratic transition and socioeconomic development in the Middle East and North Africa region. Along with Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz and economist Paul Romer, and among others, he's helped the Tunisian government, or at least helped in Tunisia, let's see if I can get this right, Adel. I'll actually read it instead of making it up. They've helped to inform the first Tunisian democratically elected government following the Jasmine Revolution about socio-economic development policies. He's also facilitated negotiations among Tunisia's political foes in support of a national dialogue quartet, which won the 2015 Nobel Peace Prize. He's going to talk on regional and business perspectives relating to the refugee crisis. To his left, actually they've tried to trick me here, Scott Watson actually, and Dr. Scott Watson received his PhD from the University of British Columbia in 2006, joined the Department of Political Science here at UVic, currently Associate Professor of International Relations and the Graduate Advisor in the Poli-Sci Department. His research interests focus broadly on international security and the responses to humanitarian emergencies. He's published on the securitization of humanitarian migration internationally and within Canada, and his current research projects explore the ideological foundations of the war on terror, humanitarian intervention, and border control policies. Scott's going to talk on the topic, Security Implications, the Refugee Crisis. What crisis, and a crisis for whom? And then to his left, Oliver Schmidtke, professor in the Department of Political Science and in the History Department, also holds the John Monnet Chair in European History and Politics, and he's currently the director of the Center for Global Studies, one of our hosts this evening. His research interests are in the fields of political sociology and the politics of migration, citizenship, nationalism, and the governance of migration and integration in Europe and in Canada. And if you listen at all to CBC, you'll know Oliver's voice. And then at the far end, Dr. Neilesh Bose, historian of modern South Asia and a Canada Research Chair, joined our department just last summer. In addition to, he's a Canada Research Chair in Global and Comparative History. In addition to the global histories of religion, secularism, and nationalism, Neilesh also holds active interests in modern histories of migration, race, law, citizenship, and state power. He's going to speak on global and historical perspectives. So you can see we have like a blue ribbon panel here this evening, I think we're going to have a great night. So I'm going to start, I think, by introducing and asking you to welcome Dr. Penny Bryden.
And is this on? It is. Is that on? Can I get it somewhere else? Can anyone hear me? No. You can? Can you hear me through a mic? Really? I could just talk. Can I put it on the other side?
Just closer to the mic.
No.
I think let's go with that. I can make it closer to you.
Oh, there we go. Okay, this is good. And I need it down. Okay, there. That feels better. A little bit better anyway. We're on me. Okay, observing the unfolding refugee crisis as an historian has meant that I've been particularly attuned to some of the parallels with events in the past. On the one hand, Canadians have had a long and somewhat uneven history of welcoming refugees. In the late 19th century, Russian refugees, Doukhobors, Mennonites, and Jews arrived in Canada. Another 20,000 Mennonites were admitted in the 1920s. At the same time that Canada was excluding immigrants from Asia, and only a few years before, Canada turned away the St. Louis, a ship filled with Jewish refugees fleeing Hitler's Germany. In the 15 years following World War II, another 250,000 refugees arrived in Canada in a variety of ways, including as sponsored relatives and as contract labor. On the other hand, there have been some surprising parallels with the way that the refugee crisis has unfolded, particularly since October 2015, and the broader themes in Canadian domestic politics. So I want to move this conversation backwards a bit and draw parallels with the distant past, some odd parallels, I'll admit, and in doing so, suggest some opportunities for the new Canadian government. There we go. Told you we would go backwards. In the 1870s, John A. Macdonald, known to us primarily as Canada's first Prime Minister, was out of office and looking for a way back. He was a clever political operative, not so clever that he was able to avoid being kicked out of office over the railway scandal, known as the Pacific Scandal, but clever enough to figure a way back. What he and his advisors came up with was a policy of high tariffs designed to stimulate the infant Canadian manufacturing industry, combined with an aggressive policy of immigration and the completion of the railway. The same one, by the way, that got him kicked out of office. Now, tariff policy is hardly the stuff of dreams, so it wasn't exactly the set of policies that secured MacDonald a victory at the polls. Instead, it was the way he sold it. He wrapped the three ideas around under the banner of the national policy, which conjured up images of nationhood, especially important in those first decades of Canada's existence as a nation, and a united effort to develop the nation. It worked as a ploy to return the Conservatives to office, and although it didn't all come together under MacDonald, the three pillars of the national policy, tariff, transportation, and people, animated Canadian policy for the next 50 years. Since then, successive governments have been searching for that elusive magic of the national policy. Currently, I want to suggest that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is embarking on a new national project that has as its centerpiece and its showpiece the reception of a small but important slice of the more than 9 million displaced Syrians. But there are other parts to this national project as well, including a redefined role in the global fight against ISIL and a redesign of the national economy based on its capacity for internationalization. The national policy and the national project have a great deal in common, plus some key differences. Both have as their goals the establishment of a presence. In MacDonald's case, the policy was designed to build an internal infrastructure, to build manufacturing and to create a domestic market through immigration and transportation. In Trudeau's case, the goal is to establish, in fact, to re-establish an international presence for a Canada that had become increasingly isolationist in the last decade or so. Nationhood has long been achieved, but becoming a global player remains an elusive dream, and one that can secure a foothold with the national project. Long ago, another wily politician, this time William Lyon Mackenzie King, the Prime Minister through most of the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, was a careful adherent of the adage that foreign policy is an extension of national policy. The national project has not forgotten this. It builds on qualities of humanitarianism that Canadians have long promoted and promises economic development through not only refugee resettlement, but trade diversification. Moreover, this foreign policy has not exacerbated existing tensions in Canada, like those between the French and English that King was so concerned about, or between rural and urban populations, or even, perhaps most surprisingly, between left and right-wing voters. Like the national policy, the national project is built upon intertwined threads. The reception of Syrian refugees stands as an acknowledgement of Canada's preparedness to resume a place in solving the world's crises. This is Canada's contribution not only to the Middle East, but also to the pressure on European nations already taking in hundreds of thousands of refugees. Upon this foundation, Canada is better positioned to change its role in the military mission against ISIL and to seek access to more global markets. Like the national policy, the national project is at least in part about optics. The quick acceptance of 25,000 refugees, an insignificant number in the grand scheme of things, was a signal more than anything else. First, obviously, of our willingness to help those in need, also to Europe, that Canada was prepared to assist its crisis of refugee reception, and to other non-European countries, specifically the US, that refugee placement was possible. The Prime Minister's midnight vigil at the Toronto airport for the first plane load of refugees was an image broadcast around the globe and began the process of re-establishing Canada's international position. Presumably, the long-term effect of this positioning will be felt at the ballot box. One key difference between the 19th century and today is that the national project is a citizen's project as much as a state project. While military or strategic intervention and economic redirection are levers used by government, the refugee resettlement, the cornerstone, I think, of the national project, brings Canadians into a relationship with foreign policy in a unique way, providing homes and education and a life for 25,000 refugees is everyone's project. And that capacity for citizen participation really makes this a project rather than a policy. The new Trudeau government is better versed in the politics of branding than any of its immediate predecessors. A role in the Middle East and North Africa, a haven for refugees, and a new internationalized economy, a new national project, has obvious branding potential. It might even be the 21st century's national policy.
Thanks. Don't go away, Penny. No, it's right here.
Am I going to quest? Oh no, that's
Yeah. So, okay, so that's really interesting. New Canadian national policy.
Project, John. Project. Yeah.
How is that project going to be affected by changes south of the border, changes in the American political world?
Well, somebody knows what's happening in the Michigan primary right now, I'm sure, and but most of us have been following what's happened thus far. We are on the eve, or the second eve, of what will be the first state dinner for a Canadian in the U.S. in almost 20 years. And it was this Prime Minister's father, Trudeau 1.0, who famously said that living next to you, the Americans, was like sleeping with an elephant. It was impossible not to feel every groan and grunt and toss and turn of that beast. So we are obviously going to be extraordinarily affected by what happens in the elections in November. I expect that whoever the candidates are and whoever wins will be more moderate than any of the potential candidates are sounding now. Primaries are fought on the margins and elections in the middle. But I expect that Canada has an opportunity, as it often has, to be more internationalist than its neighbor to the south. And perhaps there's a space available in the world for a while anyway, as the United States embarks on one of its perhaps many periods of relative isolationism.
Great, thanks very much. Let's join me. Thank you. We'll have a chance to ask your questions at the end, but now I'd like to invite Dr. Adel Guitouni, who's going to talk about regional and business perspectives around the refugee crisis.
Right, thank you. Good evening. I would start actually by saying that when I came to Canada as a student in the 80s, I never actually thought that I will stay and be part of this great country. So in the 90s, when I started thinking about going back to Tunisia, it was clear to me that Tunisia lost its kind of identity and also the purpose with the dictatorship taking the grip on the country. So I decided to apply for permanent immigration in Canada and stayed since. So thank you for giving me this opportunity actually to talk to you about a different perspective on the Syrian refugees. So the question is why a business school is interested in bringing some contribution to this. I think, actually, if you start thinking about it, business is part of the solution, and it should be part of the solution, and as we will detail a little bit. So it all started when the world has been shocked by seeing this picture. So my story is really nothing when you compare it to the story of Aylan from the Syrian town of Kobani. So in October or in September, when we started really moved by what happened, so we, as a human, we started seeing a human face to this this tragedy that is going on for a little while. I would like to share with you some of these also very artistic and expressive pictures. So this one actually, it exposes the dysfunctional world in which actually we live. We are, or our international affairs are governed by selfish and stovepiped organizations. For instance, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, just to name a few. These are multilateral organizations that are funded by nations, including Canada. They are sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars. At the same time, the UNHCR and many other humanitarian organizations are crying for funds to help refugees. So why we can't move these resources where the needs are? Why we can't do the right things? And this one, I think, and I can't say enough about how ashamed I am to see the Arab countries, and especially actually the wealthy Arab countries, doing nothing. And many of them are fueling actually the crisis, not only in Syria, but in other places. And also, I think my friends here will maybe bring the political perspective to this. I'm sometimes afraid when I start thinking about the ripple effects of what is going on in the Middle East. So this picture, in my opinion, also gets us to feel that sometimes we are losing a little bit of that humanity that we felt in the beginning when we have seen the picture. So we live in overconsumption and selfish world. We actually consider that our charity that we do from time to time is enough actually to be able to alleviate some of these sufferings. And this one is, in my opinion, very appealing. It seems, and probably it is drawn by an Arab artist, and it is symbolic because actually it is delivering that young child from hell to heaven. So with this, what I asked myself is, what kind of message, what story we are telling the people in the region, and especially who lost faith. Remember that the protests in the Arab Spring started where people went on the street asking for freedom, dignity, and social justice. So where we are from that now. So the world has reacted differently to the crisis. So we have observed a wide range of reactions to the Syrian refugees crisis, from countries using their security forces to oppress refugees and erect fences, to other countries like Germany or Canada opening doors for many refugees. Germany, for example, welcomed millions. I think that Canada is doing the right thing by offering multi-layered response that includes accepting the refugees, 25,000 up to now, offering support to international organizations and helping countries like Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. Just in perspective, Lebanon has the highest per capita refugees in the world. So there are about a quarter of the population are refugees. So imagine, like, after Trump's election, there will be 8 to 9 million Americans moving north. Sorry? So, I skipped this one, sorry. So the region, so we need actually to recognize that this region, or the MENA region, is not holistic or monolithic block. So there are different countries with different kind of resources. But the region is going through a very difficult time. So from business and economic perspective, there are 60% of the reserves of oil and 45% of the reserves of natural gas in that region. However, at the same time, unemployment rates are in the double digits in most countries. It is very difficult to find jobs, and especially for women. These 43% of those with tertiary education are unemployed, and informal economy thriving. For example, in Tunisia, more than 50% of the economy is informal, and informal economy is strengthening smuggling and terrorism. Most countries have a very large public sectors. If you take, for example, Egypt, there is about 10.5, Egypt, there is 70% of the workforce working in the public sector. There is unfair competition. There is not enough entrepreneurship. So compared to the rest of the world, this part of the world has about 0.63 a new enterprise for 1,000 working age people, compared to 4 around the world. So these countries are living this kind of these problems of socioeconomic development. So what we can do, and we live in this connected and a global world. So we know that the economy, for example, recently when actually Saudi Arabia flooded the market with oil, that affected jobs in Alberta. We know that the terrorism and the security is affecting the Canadian society as the whole. So my pitch here is Canada's agenda for the regional stability, economic opportunity, and development has to include advancing the socio-economic development. So for that, I would like actually here to recall what Mandela said is education. So my pitch here today in this discussion is beyond the immediate response to the humanitarian crisis. That's what we have done in the first place, and that is probably helping us more, helping the refugees. I would like to offer 2 major ideas. One, education and capacity building for kids, youth, and women. The only way to change their realities is through robust development programs based on respect, empowerment, and inclusiveness. We should champion an international effort to help all Syrian kids, youth, and women in camp or elsewhere to acquire the necessary skills, competencies, but more importantly, the critical thinking to say no and make a difference in their community. The second idea is inclusive, just, and sustainable socioeconomic development for all. Any lasting peace and security in that region will only be possible if people reclaim their dignity and freedom. This is not the role of the government alone. It is the responsibility of businesses and civil society. Being socially responsible and sustainable businesses, or what we call corporate social responsibility, means that we should care and we should be part of the solution. When Apple is sitting on $400 billion in cash and expecting the public utility to solve the world problem, this is not business success, this is not social and corporate responsibility. It's also true for us consumer. Imagine that you use your purchasing power to help Syrian refugees, or better, to help local entrepreneurs in that region or youth to start their businesses in those camps. You spent your dollar to help local community. It is also true for the civil society organization and NGOs. We have stopped the mentality of charity and moved toward more partnership. So what I'm saying here could be part of this now national project that Penny just mentioned, and Canada could champion this idea of smart development through a comprehensive approach, which is based on individual empowerment, on community empowerment, and institutional reforms. Thank you.
Thanks, Adel. That's great. You've spoken about entrepreneurship and you've spoken about capacity building. If you read the comment section in a local newspaper when there's an article about the Syrian refugee crisis, you'll see a lot of people worried about what happens when we bring refugees here. In such a short time frame, people are worried that they're going to overwhelm our economy here locally and overwhelm our social services. How would you respond to those kind of comments?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, I skipped that part. I did not to go really for long, but actually, we live in a country where actually the economy is built on immigrants. So the Conference Board of Canada estimated that Canada has to step up its intake of immigrants from 250,000, almost 250, 260,000 a year, to 350,000 for the next 20 years in order actually to keep up with the growth of the economy and sustain the different social programs, including actually retirement and health services. So the answer to that is kind of short-sighted. There is also an OECD study that shows that refugees may, in the OECD countries, may represent an additional kind of stress on the budgets in the beginning, but it is very, very low. For example, we estimate actually refugees, they consume about 10% of the Canadian, like the equivalent Canadian citizen on healthcare services. So it's only 10% of the equivalent of a Canadian but in the long run, most of the refugees, and if you'd like to go to the boat people and other waves of refugees that we have observed, they will become net contributors to the economy. And some will say right now, actually, the intake of refugees in Germany is contributing at least 0.5% of the GDP in the beginning as a stimuli to the consumption that is going on in the country. Thank you.
So we're going to shift for a few moments to a little bit of a video presentation. We invite you to sit back and eat your popcorn for 30 seconds, and we'll show this little video clip.
fencing, more resources, more sniffer dog teams, more assistance in any way we can in terms of resources.
So that helps, I guess, frame our discussions, at least where we're moving now. It's my pleasure to introduce Oliver Schmidtke, and Oliver's going to talk about the refugee crisis in Europe and the moral dilemma and political controversies that result.
All right. I start. Can you enlighten me? All right, here we go. So you can imagine it's a humbling act to follow images like this, and sometimes I wonder as social scientists, how limited we are in, conveying some of these messages. But let me start off by giving you a sense how differently the refugee crisis has affected Europe as compared to Canada. And this doesn't only have to do with the number of people that have arrived. This is only, into 2015, 1.5 roughly million refugees have come to the continent by now. Compare this to the relatively small numbers of refugees in Canada that we have. And what it means is the huge amount of, just the amount of challenges on the ground, but maybe more importantly, we might look back in a couple of years to this migration crisis and see it as one of these turning points in history that trigger political developments that will be felt well into the future. And I think the new reality in Europe is, and this is something that has evolved over the past 20 years since the collapse of the Cold War, that Europe can't shelter itself anymore from the rest of the world, that the borders that in a way protects the continent can be crossed relatively easily. Until the end of the Cold War, Europe could live in an illusion to be an island, protected from the misery, the violence, from those things that they tried to keep out of Europe. And that has changed tremendously in this respect. And it also poses some stark choices for European liberal democracies how to react to this. Either to opt for the Trump option, which is to build higher fences and protect the European continent even by military means, or to come up with solutions to the problem that are imaginative and that are directed towards helping these and live up to the expectation of being, in a way, the guardian of fundamental rights and human rights. And these images have become a new reality in Europe, and I think they change more than simply being a challenge to public policies. They change how Europeans relate to the rest of the world. Now, my question today is, how has Europe reacted? And maybe the very question is framed in a wrong way because Europe hasn't spoken with one voice so far. The European Union has struggled to come up with a unified and effective response at the level of the European Union. And indeed, the European Union has developed its immigration and asylum policy over the past 25 years to react to something that is a genuine European challenge. You might know, if you have ever traveled in Europe, that you can cross borders within the Schengen zone quite freely. So once refugees, irregular immigrants come to the continent, they can move across the continent. So developing a European response is a real prerogative to face this challenge. And you might also recall over the course of the last couple of weeks that there have been a series of emergency summits in which the European Union has tried to press its member state to come up with some kind of solution. And what was on the table was an idea of binding quota for the member states to accept refugees. Relatively modest numbers, 160,000 refugees that were meant to be distributed across the continent. This very modest plan was met with stiff resistance, in particular in Central Eastern Europe, where there was absolutely no willingness to engage in a constructive approach to find a pan-European solution. So no European response, but really individual member states had to step up. And it was particularly Sweden and Germany who kept, and until today have some form of open door policy, although that's changing in Sweden now as well. And Angela Merkel in Germany in particular had hoped that her leadership would move the other European member states to follow suit and engage in some form of constructive attempt to come up with a European solution, all in vain so far. And it has left basically a strategy in place which can be described as not in my backyard. You know, every country tries to fence off itself to what is perceived to be an overly burdensome influx of refugees. These are the images that you just saw in terms of the borders going up. Even within the Schengen zone, you have now reinstated border controls. All this is an indication of a failure of a European response. Now, if you follow the news, you have seen that yesterday we had another emergency summit in which the European Union approached Turkey to find a solution. And even how, in particular, how this summit was set up, what kind of questions it addressed is quite telling. Because on the agenda was really to protect the external borders of the European Union, externalizing the problem by paying Turkey to keep the borders closed or to take back irregular refugees crossing into Greece and basically to have them housed on Turkish territory. There is no solution yet. The Turks, understandably, having this very strong card in the hand, raised the stakes and demanded high price, 3 billion euros to house and settle these refugees properly, facilitated access of Turkish citizens to European visas, and an expedited process of Turkey's membership plea to the European Union. So in a way, refugees have become bargaining chips in big politics in terms of finding a solution, and that the European Union has become, in a way, also subject to these quite steep demands is an indication of how desperate they're now trying to find a solution in terms of stopping the inflow of refugees. And unfortunately, what this means is that some of those images now, some are stranded at the borders. This is an image from the Greek-Macedonian border. Tens of thousands are camped there. The Guardian this morning titled that human values are on the line in Europe. The UN Refugee Agency has stated that they're very concerned about these irregular refugees being sent back to Turkey, how they will be housed, and so forth. It's just to indicate that what Adel already referred to, our commitment to protecting human rights, to find a compassionate approach and solution to the problem is at least very difficult, and it has become subject to power politics, political interest that might not have human rights as the sole priority. One last point, because what we see and how the refugee crisis has evolved in Europe is not only a risk to these refugees themselves, their precarious situation, but it's also triggered a dangerous political development in Europe themselves. Often it is portrayed in the media that European publics are no longer willing to accept these refugees. They're overburdened. They have reached the limits of what they can tolerate. I think what you see is that civil society is actually quite willing to lend a helping hand in Europe. We have seen this across the continent, that many, like here in Canada, were quite compelled by the misery and the need for help. Rather, what we see is that political elites have used the refugee crisis as a very effective tool for political mobilization. And what we see at the moment is a resurgence of more aggressive exclusionary forms of nationalism across Europe. In particular, the extreme populist right feels emboldened in light of the current refugee crisis. And it might, and I don't want to be overly pessimistic here, but it might really deal a major blow to the very idea of uniting the continent, of the process of European integration. Some of the key achievements of the European Union are at least at risk. One is cross-border mobility. One of the key cornerstones of what the European Union stands for, to allow uninhibited mobility across the border, is one of them. The second one is the ability of the European Union to come up with effective burden-sharing collective responses to a crisis like the refugee crisis. The moment it is everybody for him or herself in terms of countries and trying to come up with a national solution to something that is a genuine European, if not global, challenge. And last but not least is what we see is the European Union, for good reasons, and you understand its political commitments, sees itself as a champion of human rights, as a cornerstone of what the political union at the European level stands for. And I think these kind of images at least cast some doubt whether European nations and the European Union can live up to the expectations that they have themselves in terms of dealing with the most vulnerable group that we have on the continent at the moment. So I tried hard to come up with something a bit more uplifting, but I'm afraid at the moment there is not much good news coming out of Europe. But we'll see where this leads. At the moment, we are really at an impasse, that there is no real solution in sight. The problem will continue. The illusion is you can close off borders, but I don't think that will be the case. We will see the continuous influx of refugees over the next couple of years. Thank you.
the end of Europe, or is there any hope of a coordinated response at the end of 5 years?
I wouldn't call it the end of Europe yet. Nobody is. What we see in the current deal, and that's not a done deal, the EU has organized another summit on March 17th where the Turkish proposition will be dealt with. But what it entails, what is on the table at the moment is that every refugee that Turkey, irregular refugee that Turkey takes back from, let's say, Greece, for every one of those, the European Union will accept one refugee from the refugee camps in Turkey, so through regularized processes. This still, however, demands an agreement of how to distribute them across Europe. It presupposes some agreement among the member states how to deal with them and how to settle them, how to provide the help that they need. And this agreement, that's at the core of the problem at the moment. This agreement is not there. The form of solidarity that you would hope to evolve in light of such a crisis is not a given. So, this is the crux at the moment, the need for coordinated, effective action at the European level. All right, thank you.
So now we have Dr. Scott Watson, and Scott's going to talk about the security implications. The refugee crisis. What crisis? A crisis for whom?
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. I wanted to start off by asking this question, that because the language itself evokes, I think, that question. And we've heard about the refugee crisis now, for those who have been paying attention, it's several years, but more prominently in the news, certainly in Canada since last summer. We've been told there is a refugee crisis. And I'm concerned then about the language that is being evoked. One, because it's ambiguous in terms of what the crisis exactly is and for whom it is a crisis. And as John alluded to in his introduction earlier, I look at the security implications of migration policy, more accurately, the way in which migrants and refugees are presented as security threats. And the evocation of crisis in this case brings forward similar language. It implies that receiving states are facing a point at which they must respond with emergency measures, or they face some uncertain and presumably negative future to which they must respond. And so I want to introduce crisis, the notion of crisis, as destabilization of belief in the existing order. Now, I realize that's a wordy way of approaching crisis, but I think it's important. And this is what I want to develop in my 8 minutes here, is that what the crisis is evoking is in fact a loss of faith in the way that the international system operates, or it's supposed to operate, and the way that it provides order, both within nation states and then between nation states. And it does so by exposing the faulty beliefs that underpin this order. I'm hoping that by the time I'm done, that will make sense. And this crisis, this loss of belief, it's partially material. It can be caused by material changes. So being forced by destruction of your home to flee your country, that's a very material development. Or people showing up on the borders, that's a material development. But the crisis is not simply that material development. It's ideas, it's a loss of faith, I would propose. And what we are losing here, I think, is important. So what beliefs are being challenged or exposed by this crisis? I would suggest there are several, and they've been hinted at already. The first is belief in the legitimacy of state boundaries and borders, and the right to enforce them unilaterally. I think that while this belief has often been challenged throughout history, it more or less still predominates that people believe that the existing borders of states around the world are in some way legitimate, and that governments have a right to enforce them. And I think we are seeing belief in that quickly collapse. In the case of Syria, the dissolution of the Syrian space, the Syrian border, challenging the colonial agreements that first created that state, have exposed the sort of colonial legacy in creating most of these borders. Right? In the case of Syria and Iraq, there are literally straight lines drawn by French and British ambassadors to decide how to carve up the Middle East. And belief in those borders are disappearing. But not just the arbitrary colonial borders of the Middle East and in parts of Africa. I would suggest belief in Europe itself as having a clear and defined border in which they have a right to exclude unilaterally is being challenged. Belief in that system is what's at crisis here. It's being exposed through the mass movement of people across these borders, despite the best efforts of many states to prevent it. I suggest the second crisis, the second belief that's being challenged, is in the promise of international institutions to provide for peace and security. That in the aftermath of World War II, with the creation of the United Nations, and certainly after the end of the Cold War, there's belief that the United Nations, backed up by American power, could probably prevent most major international crises from happening. And I think what we are seeing with the ongoing crisis in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and many other places, belief in the ability of international institutions to provide for peace and security for most people around the world is fundamentally being challenged. People are recognizing that international institutions may not offer the solutions that they have been promoting for years. And tied to that, I think, is belief that the international community will, what's often termed, burden share. That if there is a crisis of this nature, that the entire international community will come together to share the burden. That's the language that we are seeing evoked. Canada's response, for instance, taking in 25,000 refugees, was in part justified as part of a burden-sharing arrangement, that Canada must share in the burden. But if you look at what's going around the world, what I hope to highlight very briefly, that's source countries, hosting countries, there is no burden sharing going on. There's burden imposition going on. Right. So these are the top 10 refugee hosting countries. I've included Canada. Canada's not in the top 10. Just wanted them up there for the sake of reference. They're somewhere around 20th in the list. But the top 10 refugee hosting countries in the world do not look like the liberal, democratic, benevolent states that we are often led to believe, that are benefiting the rest of the world. They are the states that are immediately surrounding refugee-producing countries. And as Oliver explicitly pointed out, they are countries that are being bought off to contain refugee crises so they never enter into the Western liberal democracies. So the belief in burden sharing in international institutions, I think, is quickly eroding, although the notion of a refugee crisis doesn't often refer to that in particular. I think the third promise that's being exposed, or the third belief that's being exposed in this crisis, is in the promise of globalization to eradicate the problem of poverty and inequality. That what we're seeing here is this belief for a long period of time that with globalization and interconnected economies, this would bring prosperity for all and a reduction in disorder and conflict. But we're seeing that that belief perhaps is not true. That promise is not being borne out in what we see internationally. And so there must be, presumably, a different way to do this. I think the last one I would emphasize is a belief in a right to exit or a right to flee or seek asylum. That since the 1951 Refugee Convention, that's the international legal document that outlines the responsibilities that states have to refugees. And those obligations are actually quite minimal. They are simply not to return them, not to return refugees to the states where they face persecution. This idea is that these refugees could flee when they faced persecution. That was part of the international system. We are seeing that, that system under serious strain and inability to cope with the number of refugees in the world. That simply the UNHCR and recipient states cannot host all of the refugees that are out there, in addition to the internally displaced people. Right? So who is this a crisis for? I think I wanted to outline that that's the crisis that I see here. The crisis is that it's exposing beliefs about how the international system works that don't necessarily ring true in the face of this crisis. But who is this a crisis for? Well, before I get to the hosting states, the refugee source countries. The focus has been predominantly on Syria, and there's a good reason for that. There is a crisis in Syria, and they are producing large numbers of refugees, somewhere in the neighborhood of 4.5 million refugees. In addition, probably to between 7 and 8 million internally displaced people, which are left out of these accounts. But there are other places in the world that are experiencing population displacement. And so the emphasis on the Syrian refugee crisis, I think, does an injustice to the fact that there are refugee crises in many parts of the world that are not getting the attention, that are not getting deals made to broker those solutions in a way that we see in that case. In fact, it's not even half the population of refugees currently. But I suspect we will have no high-level summits on Sudan and South Sudan by the EU to solve a refugee crisis there. So the crisis, although I'm sympathetic to the idea, as Oliver pointed out, that Europe is facing a serious influx of people that's posing challenges. But the crises are in these countries. This is where law and order is disappearing. This is where regimes are killing their populations. The refugee hosting countries, and many of them are facing a crisis. Lebanon has a huge refugee population. If you look at per capita, it is facing a very serious influx of refugees. But it's not just, when we look at the Syrian crisis, it's not simply a crisis of who is leaving, although I think that's important to keep in mind. But there is a crisis within Syria, extreme levels of violence to which the primary response of the international community, led by the United States and up until recently supported by Canada, is to engage in a conflict on the ground, presumably towards some political solution, although that political solution is not yet clear, if it's ever been clear. So what I wanted, and this is my last slide, and I will conclude with this, what I wanted to highlight in this slide is that there are a lot of Syrian civilians being killed by a lot of different groups in Syria. And that the attention to either the refugee crisis or, on the other hand, to ISIS or ISIL as the bodies that are responsible for this crisis misses the fact that the violence being perpetrated in Syria is first and foremost predominantly the regime itself. ISIS is a problem, of course, but Assad is killing far more people within Syria than ISIS is. And the bombing campaign on which Canada has taken part up until recently has killed in excess of 20,000 people. 37,000 bombs have been dropped in Syria. Prominent Syrian activists, speaking on behalf of refugees, are saying, no more bombs. Bombs don't solve refugee crises. Bombs produce refugee crises. And dropping 40,000 more bombs in addition to all the bombs that Assad is dropping and ISIS is dropping is contributing to further displacement. And in the case of coalition-led forces, now close to 1,000 civilian casualties as a result of that bombing campaign, which Canada has recently withdrawn from. We maybe get to it in the question and answer period of what that means for Canada moving forward. But I would raise it as a serious problem because it's contributing to displacement and not necessarily to a political solution to the original crisis. Thank you.
Am I on?
Still on.
Okay, there we are. So Scott's an expert in securitization as well, and I want to ask him about that part of this world, because if you read the commentary in the newspapers and online, you'll find that many people are concerned that allowing so many refugees so quickly into our country, but not just our country, think of the French response, the chances are that we're opening a door to terrorist threats or at least security threats. What can you tell those people?
Yes, thank you. I think I'd left that part out. One, because I think that there's no empirical evidence to support the idea that bringing in refugees is a security threat. That isn't to say there aren't challenges with bringing in 25,000 refugees very quickly, but speaking to Adel's point, I think the primary issue there is ensuring the economic success of the people we bring in is crucial. But I don't think Canadians or Americans or others should be concerned about the security threats from refugees. We know that The Economist recently had a story on this, and it's not exactly a left-leaning publication, where they had shown over the last 20 years in the United States, with an intake of close to 800,000 refugees, only 4 had ever been suspected of engaging in sort of non-friendly activity, right? Or engaging in criminal or security threatening activity. None of them have been successfully prosecuted and tried. So the empirical evidence suggests that, at least in the North American context, that there has never been a case of a refugee who has come in, who's been successfully convicted of actually engaging in terrorist acts. And even then, if we even accept that 4 have been looked at for doing so, that is a drop in the bucket compared to sort of domestic crime, etc. So there really is no empirical evidence whatsoever that bringing in large numbers of refugees would pose a security threat to Canada. I think Adel put it most nicely, and Penny as well, that the refugee intakes into Canada historically have produced very productive, engaged citizens who have contributed immensely to the political culture in Canada.
Thank you. So now it's my pleasure to call upon my colleague, Dr. Neilesh Bose, who's going to talk about this whole issue in the context of larger global and historical perspectives, if we can get any larger than we have already. So welcome, Neilesh.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you to all of you who are here. And it's a great pleasure, perhaps, or a great tragedy to go last and to speak on global and, let's say, macro-historical perspectives, because much of what I will say has been said already, but in different ways by many of the panelists. But I will address, I think, some of the issues that have already been raised in macro and global historical contexts. The particularities, of course, are very important of the Syrian civil war and the entry of the United States of America and Russia as major military actors in the region. And as has been already mentioned, the numbers of refugees, however, in a broader context, 4.5 to 5 million people, not even counting the internally displaced people in Syria, is really a very small portion of the broader refugee situation facing the world. Today, I'll just briefly talk about the broader history of refugee creation. According to the UNHCR, the approximate number of refugees in the world today is between 19 and 20 million people, and the vast majority of those people are in Africa at approximately 13.5 to 14 million people, as was implied in the last presentation by Scott, that there are areas of the world, in particular the South Sudan and in the Sudan itself, where there is much more detailed quantitative crisis, but it is not containing the attention of the world today. Now, to get to this first slide here, when does the figure of the refugee, in its context that we know of today within the world of nation states, begin in the context of the post-World War II era, from the mid-1940s onward? This map is a map of the world from 1945. And those areas in red include areas that were either a part of former European empires or areas that included those that were displaced and could not be placed into the world of nations and nation states. This signals to us the broader context that the world from 1945 onward is a world that holds a European imperial system that has broken into a collection of incomplete and unresolved decolonizations. This next image that I'll show that will help us think in a micro sense of this broader theme is an image of refugees created by the partition of British colonial India in 1947 in the northwestern parts of South Asia and the Punjab. The division of Bengal and the Punjab, which attended this partition and the moment of nation-state creation, is the place where the world saw the breakup first of European empires into newly constructed non-European-led nation-states, and then created refugees in India and Pakistan in 1947. That entire process created approximately 14 to 15 million people as refugees from the beginning of these two nation-states. The process of refugee creation and its responses by the nation-states of the world is comprehensible historically within three kinds of macro global historical change. One, the nature and meaning of sovereignty by nation-states. Two, the patterns of migration in the modern world. And lastly, the definitions and locations of refugees in the contemporary post-World War II landscape. About sovereignty, modern sovereignty in the current system of approximately 190 nation-states is a relatively new and definitively modern phenomenon born in the system of competing European empires falling apart. The highly aggressive and the violent resource extraction that the world had seen in the 19th and early 20th centuries in colonized regions of Asia and Africa also falling apart, alongside the creation of wealthy, powerful, resource-rich, and population young settler and post-settler states in North America and parts of the Pacific and parts of North Africa and Southeast Asia from the 1880s up until the moment of World War I. This was a colonial world order, which backed the diplomatic negotiations in 19th century Europe, which was backed also by an economy based in resource extraction and occupation. As in the British Empire in India, its end symbolized here, the breakup of colonial India, an occupational empire in Southeast Asia, parts of Africa, and then the French Empire in West Africa and Southeast Asia as well, in addition to the world, parts of the world that became settler states, all backed up by the European sovereign systems. Within this context, the context of sovereignty up until 1945, we find three major formations of large-scale human movement. The movement of laborers, pioneered by transatlantic Euro-African slave trades and then indentured labor in the Indian Ocean. Also, the movement of imperial service for European empires. And then the final form of human movement, the breakup of nation-states via militarized conflict after World War II. There's, of course, much to say about all of these three different forms of movement from the world built in the 19th century, but as time is short, I'll just focus briefly on the role of India in the world system from the world wars onward, as this is a way to track all of these different systems of movement that lead us to the world that we live in today. About the world wars in Europe up until World War II. The sparks for war in Europe, of course, were nominally for the creation of localized nationalist movements in the Balkans and other flashpoints of imperial crisis, but places like Africa and India, the traditional suppliers of labor and resources that made this system run, started to break up the entire glue that held the system together. Not only with nationalist movements emerging from India in the late 19th century, but widespread disaffection in the lack of any resolution of the colonial question. So in India, for example, in the 20s and 30s after World War I, the colonial state clamped down on any protests and became more and more violent in their repression of any critiques of the system and lost most of the legitimacy that they once had. Just before World War I, settler regions of the world, such as Canada, the United States, South Africa, and Australia, had been experimenting with exactly how to square their own ambitions to speak to the points made by Scott and by Oliver, to how to exclude potential residents and still maintain ideals that at that time were cherished by European empires like non-racial forms of citizenship. The result of this tension in the 1890s in the Anglophone parts of the world was the so-called Natal formula, based in South Africa, designed to exclude Indian migrants to travel freely between Natal and its contiguous Boer republics in the interior of South Africa, based on a number of determinants. At first, European language proficiency, then health, hygiene, and other determinants, many of which last up until this day, that inform the discussions we have in Europe right now. The world system was breaking down in World War I as the European empires had no choice, both in terms of human loss and irrevocable financial debt. As an example, Britain paid for their war primarily by borrowing money and manpower from India and not paying it back. The return on the debt was a negotiated independence. But if we continue with India as a paradigmatic example, as it was the first portion of the British Empire to decolonize, after lengthy negotiations, the only version that British imperial officials would approve of a decolonization process was a rushed version of a Pakistan, again one of the biggest sources of refugees in the world today. For Indian Muslims, some of whom had been agitating for a separate state within a federated India, and then an India for the rest of the Indian populations. This left the issue of population transfer, fear of being in the wrong community, in the wrong place, which depended on sorting out who belonged where. Here, in the mid-19 to late 1940s, is where refugees were first created in the modern context, in a manner that approximates an origin point for the continual history of movement after 1945, in which members of formerly colonized areas in the global south have to contend with a new world of nation states. So as I mentioned earlier, the numbers in India and Pakistan, approximately 14 to 15 million refugees were produced between India and Pakistan in the first 4 years of those two states' existence, and showed to the world a nation-state model implemented quite hurriedly in a place where European empires used to rule. Refugees in these spaces were created after World War II as a result of the departure of European empires without any infrastructure in place to manage the new world of nation-states, but with a newly formulated so-called international community and power, again to speak to Scott and Oliver's points, presuming that nations on European models existed for the rest of the formerly colonized world. And this presumption informs the first global discussions of the ideas of refugees as they begin in 1951 with the Geneva Convention on Refugees, which met and produced the first document that we know of, which was revised in 1967 to include all people. Initially, it was defined only in European terms, but remains as a primer for defining to the world who a refugee is, primarily as those displaced through persecution via race, religion, or some other principle, and retaining the presumption of a national identity as a guiding principle to organizing human movement. And the first modern discussions of how a global community could engage these issues occurred a bit earlier with the League of Nations, confronting the ideas of refugees retroactively. So defining refugees through the various scattered Jewish populations throughout the world, or through the large Huguenot populations throughout various European imperial locations, and various other European references did emerge in the earlier discussions, but they culminate with the identification of massive displacement in Europe itself through World War II, the rise of the Nazi state, and then its legacies and aftermath, to the rise of millions of refugees in Europe, of course, through the 1930s and afterward. But since the world of nation states has been instituted, really just to speak to the points that have already been made here, concomitant with the creation of refugees is a system of sovereignty that is still based in that late 19th century model, with states having the right to exclude, based on religious, racial, linguistic, other cultural considerations, perhaps an idea of Europe itself, but living within a global capitalist world where goods and commodities and finances and currencies flow freely, but the laborers who build that world live in an ever more monitored and precarious condition. Refugee creation in the contemporary post-1945 world flows out of the incomplete decolonizations of the recent past, coupled with other crises, again, rising ecological crises and food shortages that push people to migrate away from their homes. And all of the points that I've mentioned here I'd plan to speak a bit more of, but I'll just end in the interest of time and conclude by stating that the world is witnessing the unraveling of older sorts of sovereignty, the power to exclude, with the realities of the global capitalist world that is occurring in tandem with the ongoing decolonization of the Middle East. The decolonization of the latter region has not been, unlike South Asia, the Indian subcontinent, or Southeast Asia, which saw independent states and indigenous cultural movements accompany their own national identities flourish outside of a violent opposition to imperial power, this has not been able to be realized in the Middle East itself. Figuring out how sovereignty and decolonization may coexist, or to speak to the last 2 points by Oliver and Scott, to speak to the idea of Europe outside of its imperial past, to decolonize the idea of Europe itself may be the way forward. It will point to how Europe and the post-settler states of North America, like Canada and the United States, have to confront this shifting landscape through perhaps considering their own forms of sovereignty, their own methods of exclusion, in line with recognizing the histories of those people who had not been included in past states in modern history. And I'll end there, and thank you for your time.
So I'm going to ask him about the future. So Neilesh, you challenged the idea of sovereignty and how they've existed so far. And so my question for you is, how will the nation state, how does it have to adopt in the near future to respond to these crises that you just laid up for?
Well, as a historian, perhaps I'm the least qualified to speak about the future. But if the past is any guide, perhaps those very sources of exclusion would have to be revisioned and addressed in any vision for the future. So let's say the idea of Europe as a project, as an idea, the idea of Canada as a project, as an idea, what are the bases by which this can be delimited? In previous eras, there have been ascriptive identities vis-a-vis race, religion, language, whatever else, civilization, culture that were at the basis of determining those limits. And perhaps the nation-state's future lies in identifying other ways of defining who is in and who is out. And the previous precedents perhaps may not be pushing for any viable future.
Okay, thanks. So now I'm probably double mic'd here. I'm going to try and turn off one of these mics. I'll stand away from the mic, that's what I'll do. So just a few thoughts, I guess, before I open the floor to questions while we sort of set up for this. Scott has really broadened out the whole question of what is the crisis. We call this addressing the refugee crisis, how the world has responded. And I think the various panelists have kind of stretched out the notion of crisis and beyond what many of us probably thought when we came here, that we were talking about Syria or a Syrian crisis or a refugee crisis. So, and I think both Penny and Neilesh and Oliver, to a certain extent, have kind of stretched out that notion of this crisis didn't just happen starting last summer or last fall. This has been a slow burning fire that has had an incendiary poured on it with the collapse of Syria and other states in the Middle East, and exploded to our attention in a way that we've never noticed before. But the crisis has been there in Africa, and it's been there in other parts of the world for the long haul. And Adel, of course, is actually, among the panelists, is the one who's kind of, I think, proposed some optimism and a way forward that we might think. So let me just offer a few words of my thoughts, which is, I'm probably like a lot of you. I was, the usual Canadian, doing my gardening in Victoria in the summertime and turning on the TV from time to time and watching the crisis kind of slowly build and feeling an increasing sense of helplessness and desperation over the summer and into the fall as this crisis built and built and built. And we had these sessions in the fall, and we talked about some of the things we could do. And one of the things that we talked about in the fall was, well, we could sponsor a Syrian refugee family. And so, in fact, my colleagues in the history department, some of them here, some of them around, were one of the many groups in Victoria who have responded and sponsored a refugee family. And that's fantastic. That is fantastic. I'll bet, Victoria has responded in Victoria and Canada, I would say, has responded in such a generous way to this crisis. It makes me proud to be a Canadian, proud to be a Victorian. And yet, I want to say that the crisis has only gotten worse since we started fundraising. Since we have these families here, and now this, I think, I've just been told that I think in British Columbia now, there are, since November, there have been, where's my number, 2,200 refugees brought into British Columbia since last November. Syrian refugees, basically. That's a big number for a place like Victoria anyway, or not Victoria, British Columbia. We've responded very generously, but as you've heard, 2,200, 25,000, even if we increase that number, as the government is saying now, by another 10,000, is just a small part of the problem. I think there's a danger, now that many of us are involved with the families that are here, and we're helping them, we're excited, we're seeing them adopt to their new homes, that we think maybe we've done our part. That we can relax now, that the crisis, well, maybe the crisis isn't over, but we're doing our part. And I guess I want to suggest that as fantastic as it is, as what we've done, the problem gets bigger day by day, and you've had that sketched out for you here. So, again, I think there's a danger of feeling helpless. Okay, we've done what we can, throw up my hands. I can't do anything more, but that's not the case. I think there's still tons of things we can do. And so let me suggest a few of them to you before I turn the floor over to you and for questions. So, first of all, the biggest problem is still in Jordan, and it's still in Turkey, and it's still in Lebanon, and it's still in Syria, and there are refugee camps there that need support. The UNHCR is in desperate need of resources. So if you have some spare resources and you don't want to feel helpless, one way is to just go online. You can go to any one of those organizations. You can go to the Red Cross. You can go to CanadaHelps.org, and whatever you have, whatever you feel you can spare. And when I say whatever you feel you can spare, think about this. This is the worst crisis, refugee crisis of our time, of our lives, really. And I think, as the panelists have pointed out, this is the beginning of a world change in terms of population movements and nation states and how Europe and other countries will define themselves. We're at a historic moment now, and the world is not going to be the same in 5 years or 10 years because of what's started happening this summer. So it's not a time for just an ordinary response. I normally give $100 to the Red Cross every year. This year I'll give $100 to the refugees. I think we're called upon to do something extraordinary. So one way is to give money. Another way is to volunteer. And there are lots of organizations now that there are Syrians here in town and starting to find their place, becoming Canadian citizens. They need help. They need help in all kinds of ways, but I think the way they need help most is to find work and to find jobs. So if you happen to know people who run a small business who can hire somebody who doesn't speak English very well or help them get off the ground, that's a great way that you can help. Public opinion is a huge player in this game. It's a huge player. And as I mentioned before in my comments, if you happen to read the online comments on newspaper articles or YouTube videos, there is a lot of misunderstanding out there. There is a lot of negative commentary about refugees coming to the country. If you have a cousin or uncle or a nephew who kind of espouses these, or you maybe suspect he is one of, has shared these views, have a chat with them and talk to them, because it's really important that Canada stays on board with this project and that our politicians know that Canada is on board with being generous to refugees. And then I have with me here, if you're interested in sponsoring a refugee, there are many more refugees that need a home. Refugees, of course, from Syria, refugees from all of those countries in Africa and the Middle East, North Africa that have been mentioned. And I'm going to want to tell you about a public meeting for community volunteers if you're interested in being involved. Monday, March 14th at 7:30. This is a project of what's called the Two Saints and Friends. Two Anglican churches, St. David's by the Sea and St. Peter's Lake Hill, are having a meeting Monday, March 14th, 7:30 at St. David's Anglican Church for people who are interested in getting involved in sponsoring refugees. So I'll say this again at the end of the evening, but we don't have to feel helpless. There are lots and lots of things we can do. And in fact, I think we are called to do more. So with that, I'm going to open the floor and remind you Remind you that there's a couple of microphones. There's one there. If you're able, on this side of the room, and you're able to move to it, that's what I suggest. We need you to move to the microphones so everybody in the room can hear, but also so all of those millions of people who want to watch you on TV can also do that. And there's another microphone over here, and if you raise your hand, our lovely assistant will move around and bring the microphone to you. So I open the floor. I think our panelists have microphones. They do, and they're working. And so open the floor to questions, and I'll try and moderate from here. So way in the back corner, right behind you there, move to the microphone, please.
Hello. I think this question's for Scott. When you were looking at the statistics about the deaths in Syria, I'm not sure where exactly you got that number, because last time I checked, the UN stopped counting around 250,000 a few years ago, and now they think it's closer to 500,000. So your total seems very small. Is that for just a limited period of time, or?
Yeah, some of the numbers, I don't know where the slide is now. The numbers on deaths from the Assad regime and ISIS are from the U.S. State Department. It's cumulative so far, so I don't necessarily doubt that they're all that accurate, but of course take it with a grain of salt. The numbers on deaths from the coalition air bombing is from an NGO, Air Wars, which uses data points from both U.S. media sources and media sources in Syria. But I mean, if you go out and look for these numbers, you will find a huge range of numbers, and some I would guess are inflated and some are underreported. I've tried to find the numbers that I think are likely most objective based on the sources that they've used. Well, not for their own deaths. I haven't used the State Department to calculate American-caused deaths, but rather deaths caused by ISIS and the Assad regime. So I suspect in that case, Assad regime is probably underreported. But it's difficult to get accurate numbers on there, but what we know is that Assad is responsible for most of the deaths. I mean, I think there's a range, but I don't think there's very much credible reporting to suggest that Assad's regime and his various backers are not, in fact, responsible for most deaths in Syria.
All right, thank you. I have somebody at this microphone over here.
Thanks, panelists. My name's Chris Cook. I'm here with CFUV Radio at the University of Victoria. Thanks a lot. I feel a little dissonant. I think maybe rather than asking how the world, and by that I suppose we mean how the West has responded to this crisis, as you call it, how have we engendered it? I mean, how can we feel proud as Canadians to take in some thousands of people from a war zone that we've helped create? We're selling weapons into this area. Our airplanes are dropping bombs on people. These numbers are ridiculous. I just think that we are addressing the wrong question here.
It is a question, whether it's the right or wrong question. Who wants to take that from the panel?
I don't mind responding. One of the things I wanted to point to is the fact that the focus on refugees and resettlement is in many ways distracting attention from what are perhaps more fundamental questions. And resettlement is always the third preferred option of the UNHCR and other agencies involved. Most people involved with refugees recognize that resettlement is not going to solve crises. It represents a drop in the bucket for the number of people that are out there. And so I certainly would not want to present it as though resettlement is the answer. I think the other crises that are caused by these various other factors need to be addressed. And until you address them, you're not really addressing the refugee crisis. So, I mean, I agree with you that there's root causes here that aren't being addressed. That said, that shouldn't render us helpless in actually responding to refugees. And we still have to respond to that basic problem, even as we are responsible to deal with other root causes at the same time. So it's not a matter of choosing one or the other. You've got to deal with all of them.
I see a couple questions. A gentleman in the back, and then not quite in the back, yeah, sort of second row there. Oh, well,
Oh,
you'll be
second
next.
reverse? There you
Yeah. All right. Could you say your name, Amy, please? Introduce yourself.
My name is Muhammad Yunus Mirza. I'm a community member. My question is, I have a comment before that, which is, while I appreciate all the charity and the generosity that people are showing for refugees, I suggest to you that charity and generosity is no substitute for justice and dignity. Having said that, my question is, why don't we address the real issue, as the earlier gentleman said, why don't we shut down the refugee industry that our own neo-colonial and imperial systems are creating? Why don't we condemn wars that create these refugees? Why are we only touching on the symptoms and not the real causes to cure the disease? And why don't we make the culprits, the aggressors, pay for their crimes as a compensation to those refugees, in addition to our own generosity? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Okay. Okay, go ahead.
I know, I think, I agree with you, but the problem is, who's going to make that happen? So, and this is actually where we get to so we understand actually there are a lot of interests, there are a lot of powers playing in that area. So I mentioned, for example, so we talk about the superpowers, but we talk also about the local powers, and we can talk also about the elite and the corrupt people in those regions as well, because it's really kind of alignment of different kind of interests that are creating these kind of conditions. But the problem is, who is going to be able to stop these wars? When you see at the superpower level, the people who have the control or they can really make difference in that region, let's say the Syrian crisis, are fueling it. So again, going back to what Scott said, is I think we cannot choose. Unfortunately, we don't have the choice. We have to condemn those roots of the problems, but at the same time, we have to do something actually to alleviate some of the suffering. And I go back, actually, I think, in my opinion, I'm coming from that region, the most important weapon, again, to be able to fight back those kind of wars and sectarian wars and post-colonialism is education and empowerment of the people. And that's, I think, where we can do now with the technology that we do have. Now we have the ability to connect people to people. And I think, as we're saying, that the crisis of the refugees is maybe threatening this kind of nation states and the boundaries and so on. But we now, with the digital economy, with the technology, with the information, with the Facebook and whatever, we are also reducing the boundaries between people. So if we are able to work and empower the peoples, I think we can make some kind of headways. But it is more complicated than simply just decrying the wars, because it's going on for the history of the human being.
Thank you. And I think Dr. Bose Neilesh was also talking about some of those root causes that you raised now. He was talking about some of those. So I don't think we're trying to sweep that away. So who's first? Yeah, this gentleman, the roots. Can you maybe say your name?
Yeah, my name's Ashley. My question is for Scott. The pie charts, I noticed there was a country missing on each chart. Which country was it that was missing between Ethiopia and Lebanon for the countries hosting refugees, and which country was missing between the refugee influx?
I don't know.
South Sudan and Afghanistan.
I don't know. When I sent it on, it was on there, I think, so I'm not actually sure. Yeah, I don't,
Scott?
I can bring the version, my version, but.
Scott, it was Somalia for the first one.
Yes?
And Iran for the second.
Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, so I think I'll go to this side of the room next, in the very back row, and then I'll come back to you there.
Hi, my name is Alvin Nagel. I'm a citizen of the Netherlands, visiting Canada. I have a question for Dr. Schmidtke. You've painted quite a somber picture of the future of the EU, and I was wondering what will be the expected effect of a future of a Europe if it is politically falling apart to a country such as Canada.
Okay. I'm not, I wouldn't go as far as you do in your presumption that it would make the EU fall apart, but it clearly is a major challenge, in particular with respect to what I've tried to describe in terms of the long-term political consequences, the resurgence of a more exclusionary form of nationalism, what Neilesh related to, an old European tradition, that is, the very substance that the European Union tried to overcome. If indeed Europe would disintegrate, and I don't think that we are there yet. It is just a challenge that really, has at least been a major challenge. But if we go this route, right, it would mean that the role of Europe would be diminished in the world in terms of economic relationships, its political weight in international politics. So it would have a whole host of repercussions. And the next step will be the Brexit, the decision whether the UK stays in Europe. The ability of Europe to speak with one voice will be crucial also in terms of world politics and critical decisions affecting the region and refugees. So it will be felt in Canada in particular that Canada is about to sign a free trade agreement with the European Union. So we talked about the kind of global world that we're in, refugees being an indication of how the world has come together, and I think there's an Atlantic Ocean in between Canada and the European Union, the impact of these kind of decisions are felt very closely. So there's an elephant down south, and maybe, I'm not sure what animal, comes to mind, when it comes to the European Union.
All right, thank you. This gentleman here.
My name is Edward Weeb. I'm from Edmonton, Alberta. I hope an Albertan is allowed to ask a question. My question is to the lady on the panel. There have been several waves of refugees since the Second World War coming into Canada. The Czechs, the Hungarians first, the Czechs, and then the Vietnamese. And on that basis, do we have any way of predicting and therefore preparing for any special problems that the present wave of refugees is likely to present?
Thank you. Dr. Bryden, do you want to handle that one?
Well, I think we do have examples of ways in which refugees have been incorporated. More importantly, we've got statistics on, as much an answer to questions of concern about what happens to refugees once they're here. Statistics that I don't have in front of me, but a few of the things off the top of my head that I can recall is that within the refugees that have arrived since the 1960s, within 10 years their earning power is the same as Canadians of the same age, that their second generation refugees are more likely to attend university than Canadian-born citizens. So of that group, we've got lots of evidence that suggests that whatever was done in the past in terms of the models of community reception and incorporation were successful both from a refugee standpoint, but from a Canadian economic standpoint as well.
Thank you. I agree that there's lessons to be learned. I'm not sure that anybody has done all the studies and kind of the continuity of knowledge that we might need from that to be able to apply those lessons, but I think that's a really good question. I see this woman here, and then I'll come back to your side. Yeah.
Oops. Hello. My name is Salam. I'm an immigrant from that lovely part of the world called the Middle East, which long before Syria has not exactly been a haven of tranquility. And I'm wondering, and this is my question for Dr. Schmidtke more than anybody, in the back and forth negotiations in Europe, is anybody trying to address the other lightning rod that is in the Middle East, which is basically the Arab-Israeli conflict and the subject of illegal settlements that are going on in the West Bank, and how that topic is always used by radicals on the right and the left in the Middle East when they're trying to justify their war against the West or against Western ideals or anything of that sort. Thank you.
Just, an observation, and that's something that has been brought up here by questions, is how, in a way, the refugee issue is strangely detached from addressing some of the root causes of what drives refugees, the instability in the region, and so forth. So what you see, maybe it is compartmentalized in terms of public policy making, maybe it is a deliberate choice not to address these difficult questions, because it's easier to deal with people on the ground and, the challenge is there. And Europe is, again, it tries to move towards speaking with one voice, European foreign policy, but as you know, countries are quite divided over how to relate to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in the region. You see this here in Canada. Canada is about to change course yet again, and being a more constructive partner and trying to move, this conflict to somewhat of a more fair settlement. So I think we could do this next year for the IdeaFest, right? That would open a whole different can of worms in terms of addressing. But you see the many amounts of questions that try to put the refugee question into a bigger perspective, the underlying root causes, and clearly the instability in the Middle East is one of the driving forces behind this.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you, Oliver. And over here, please.
Yeah, sure. Hi, my name's Jennifer Begelman, and I work at the university. I really enjoyed that each of you, in different ways, reflected on the ways in which colonial legacies have given rise to the global refugee crises we see today. And I'm just wondering to what degree you think it's important to really address these intersecting forms of violence and to think about indigenous struggles here on unceded territory, right? We're gathered today on the Kwangin and Wasanic, First Nations territories, and to think about this in relation to the refugee crises that you've laid out, and how would you go about doing that?
Is this part of the Canadian project?
Yeah, I think it is. As I think about the idea of a national project, I framed it today in terms of intertwined components of a structure that's kind of resting on the idea of refugee resettlement. But as I was doing it, I thought, but there's more to it than that, and I can't make it fit. So I was trying to fit a round object into a square hole. But I recognize, and I think that increasingly governments at all levels recognize that there's a domestic project that that mirrors an international situation, whether it can be understood in the same fabric, I don't know. But I do think that increasingly indigenous sovereignty, questions of indigenous integration and recognition of land is part of a broader Canadian domestic national project that maybe is a better foundation to understand the kinds of strategies that are being used now to build a whole set of ideals upon.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. The reminder that we're meeting on Songhees and Lekwungen territory, and I think your question relates a bit to Neilesh's discussion about the changing ideas of sovereignty and the multiple the notions that we have to rethink what sovereignty means in nation states. So thanks very much for that question. Over here, this gentleman.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Thanks to the panel for very thoughtful presentations this evening. My name is Don Scott. I'm a citizen and often participant in things here at the university. I really appreciate the opportunities the university gives us citizens of Victoria to come and to continue our education through our lives. Just as a comment and a start, is that one of the things with the refugees here is it's interesting that the Palestinians have disappeared from the charts, and there's something like 6 million Palestinian refugees if you go back to the 48 and since then, and the descendants of those original refugees. But one of the things, my question is going to be centered around the need for international bodies, as was raised by one of the presenters. And to me, the United Nations has been almost set aside, shuffled aside, since especially the 1980s. The U.S. had no interest in promoting the United Nations as a body as it did in 1948 and 1950s when the United Nations was really formed. Its voice has been sorely missed. And I'm wondering whether or not there's a capacity to rebuild the United Nations, because what we've had for the last 30 or 40 years is individual countries determining that they are going to be the saviors of the world and moving into the areas. And, you know, obviously the U.S. is the biggest single partner, but when the U.S. went into Iraq, it had England riding side saddle and a bunch of other countries. When it went into, and it claimed to have UN sanctioned to some of their actions. So they use the UN as a convenience to be able to move in on international aggressive, if you wish, or invasions, really. In Libya, similarly, there it was NATO, wasn't UN sanctioned, but NATO more or less sanctioned that. Everywhere we've gone, we've left destroyed nations, and we've created this massive refugee crisis that we have today, although we here in North America, you don't feel it. But I'm just wondering how the world gets back to using the United Nations as a vehicle to stop these things from growing and to sort of stop make efforts at least to stop civil wars from expanding, or even interventions and foreign interventions, and whether it would ever be possible for the United Nations to make the intervening nations, the aggressor nations, if you wish, to be responsible for the package, for putting the country back together, and responsible for the refugees. I think if we ever had a situation where the country that invaded another country is responsible for the refugees that come out of that, we'd have a whole lot fewer of these. I don't know how you would enforce it, though.
Somebody wants to address that? Scott?
I'll respond very quickly. Thank you on the Palestinian question. Palestinian refugees are counted not under UNHCR, which is not the governing body for Palestinian refugees, but the UNRWA. They have their own organization. So thank you for bringing it up, because anytime you use UNHCR stats, it will exclude Palestinian refugees who are governed under a completely different institution. So that's a fair point. On the UN question, I guess the only thing I would say is the UN can't get back, I don't think, to anything, because I'm not sure it was ever really a functional institution for preventing refugee crises or wars. And so I wouldn't want to participate in a narrative that presents the UN as having been functional at one point and no longer functional. I think it's a story of continuity of dysfunction. But primarily it's a statist institution. It's designed to protect the sovereignty of states. And so expecting such an organization to protect refugees, I think expects something that it's actually not designed to do. So I think it's actually part of the problem, and probably it cannot solve issues outside of the question of sovereignty, since it's designed to preserve sovereignty. It would be a quick answer, but I think you respond to the last question.
I was going to say that we're going to run out of question times, but if you have a quick response, Neilesh, go ahead.
Yeah, just as quick as I can be. About the UN situation, I just say that I guess a question that comes out is whether or not the nation form can ever be imagined and enacted with any space of equity, equality, or dignity across space. And I think the answer historically at least has been no. And so if the past is any precedent, the nation form as it defines the boundaries of states has not been able to do much to protect people from what we see. Just very quickly about the question of indigeneity and indigenous peoples, I think that the question of sovereignty is not an either-or question. It certainly is a both-and situation, that when these issues can be understood to be deflecting from other issues like the questions of indigenous peoples, they need to be included front and center in any rethinking of how states are organized. So just wanted to say that as well.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question here, and then we have a few questions up here, and then I'm going to have to call the floor closed.
Hi.
Close at the appropriate time. So tell us your name.
Hi, my name is Zainab Guitouni, and I have a suggestion. Can we help children refugees too?
So the question is, can we have children refugees here in Victoria? Is that the question? No. Yeah, so, well, I can just say that the family that the history department has sponsored has 3 children, 7, 9, 11, but I think just about every one of the families that are coming to Victoria have kids of all kinds of ages with them. So I think if you're interested in connecting with some of those kids, I'm sure we can help you out there. So I'm going to ask people to be maybe brief with their questions and the respondents to be brief with their answers, and we'll try and get through those 3 people who are nicely queued up over there before we go.
Sure. Hi. Sorry I have to follow up from such an adorable question. I want to thank you for coming and speaking, to the facilitator as well for meeting here on Lekwungen territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nation. I think that's something we really need to be cognizant of, especially when we're talking about inviting people into Canada and, you know, whose is it to invite people to, etc. So it's something I challenge you to really, really think about. But my question is something that obsesses me and that I think about all of the time. And we have a tendency to look to our proverbial neighbors to the south and to look towards Donald Trump and some of the things that are happening there. And I think there's lots of things that have happened in Canada recently that are huge changes, and it's sure there's going to be maybe changes in America, but we've just gone through elections very recently, and so we had a party before, and now we have a new party, or maybe not, and we had a party that operated one way, and now we have a new party that operates a different way, or maybe not. And so the reason I keep going back to this, maybe there isn't so much change, is that in 2015 we saw the government voting along, the current Liberal government voting alongside some of the most racist and Islamophobic legislation that we've seen in decades in Canada. So we have the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, which in and of itself is racist. We have Bill C-51 as well, which scapegoats communities. It's no hidden secret that Islamophobia is written all over this garbage legislation. And so what does it mean? And maybe, sorry to keep picking on you, Scott, but I think maybe this is a question directed to you. What does that mean when we're bringing refugees into a country and we're holding up Trudeau in such high regards as bringing in 25,000 people this year, but also inviting them to a country where their ability to participate in political dissent and communicate with the government through protest is put at risk, and where their citizenship can be stripped and things like that. So maybe that is for you.
Okay. So Scott, would you like to respond? I'll respond very briefly. Thank you for the question. When Trudeau is following up on Harper, he has, very small shoes to fill. So he looks good at first. So when this panel happened originally back in September, I think everyone was quite concerned because the Harper government was in power, and then Trudeau came in, and it looks like there's been some changes, particularly on the refugee file, not so much in other areas. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done. But the tone on refugees between the Harper government and the legacy of that government over his years in power and the reduction of protection for refugees that he brought about in this country, compared to the language and policies that Trudeau's bringing about, I think actually is a significant change, notwithstanding the Liberal support of all these other policies, which is reprehensible. But I think there's a lot more work to be done. But again, compared to Harper, it's easy to look pretty good on this particular file.
Great, thanks. I'm going to have to move on because we are just running out of time. So I invite the next questioner there. Thank you for your question.
Yeah. I'm afraid, Scott, I'm going to go after you as well. And I'd like to call on the national project aspect. But Scott, I'm going to vehemently challenge your numbers with regard to the Syrian government. I'm going to challenge your description of them as the Assad regime. I'm going to call the Trudeau regime or the Obama regime or the Cameron regime like equal standards for all. Who are we in Canada who still have an original sin regarding indigenous peoples, which other people have brought up. I don't think we have any right to judge the Syrian government. I really don't. And and I'd like you to respond to your use of very loaded language. And then on the national project, my suggestion, and if I'd appreciate your response, is our national project should be one of them should be to nurture our own sovereignty, to hell with those people to the south, whoever they are, and to have a truly independent foreign policy, so that then we can do what is appropriate in the international sphere and not really be agents or clients for the empire, whatever that is, the USA or the EU or whatever. And we should be doing things that allow a country like Syria, which was the most stable, the most secular country in the Middle East, to rekindle itself and to repair from this horrific war, which was mostly perpetrated on it by external forces, in my opinion.
Thank you for the question. Scott and Penny.
Yeah, I think insofar as any of us can sit in judgment, I have no problem condemning the Assad regime based on the evidence that's come out. That in no way absolves, that is no way meant to absolve the responsibility of the Bush regime for the crimes they perpetrated in Afghanistan and Iraq. But if we're simply looking at objective facts, the Assad regime is a reprehensible regime that's killed many of its own citizens. The rebels have done so as well. ISIS has done so as well. The Americans have done so. So my presentation was not meant to absolve other actors for what they've done, but to point out that if we are to formulate a foreign policy that makes sense, it doesn't make sense to identify one actor, whether it's ISIS or the United States or the Assad regime. There's many actors killing many people there, and we need to take that into consideration.
Look at a country like Cuba, which rises above everything and is just trying to help. That's a truly sovereign country, I would suggest.
Thanks for letting Penny respond.
And just on the question of the national project, I think Canadian foreign policy has always striven, whatever the word is. Gosh, do I give lectures for a living? Has always aimed for independence from the U.S. in varying degrees, whether it's in terms of the optics or the reality. And I would suggest that the moves that have started in the last few months, starting with the refugee resettlement, are a step towards creating some space and creating some separation, and conceivably considerably more separation from American policy 6 months from now than it is right now, that will allow perhaps an even greater opportunity for a truly independent Canadian foreign policy.
Thank you. And a final question, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the panel, and thank you everyone for just bearing with me on the final question. And it's directed to Scott, but also to, I think it reverberates to Oliver Schmidtke's area, and that is the problematization of the word crisis. I'm wondering how to respond to what happens when these crises engender a normalization of the crisis situation. And I'm just going to bring the three type of crises and then what they're normalizing into. So for the idea of security and terrorism leads to C-51, or the crisis of international trade and the World Trade Organization, it leads to the TPP or CETA, bilateral trades. Or for globalization, this crisis leads to an engendering of more nationalism. And I feel like, how do people respond when the only language we have is those are three crises in of themselves, C-51, TPP, nationalism. So what language is left for people advocating to stop that normalization? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I think the beauty of crises is that they are open opportunities. Not to say that they're not structured in some ways, because some people are still privileged in being able to articulate an appropriate response. But nonetheless, because they destabilize, they open up opportunities for those who would challenge the existing order. And so sometimes it leads into strengthening of regimes, but sometimes it opens opportunity for people to protest and bring about real change. So mostly I would say that they're opportunities. They're structured opportunities. They're not equal opportunities, but I think they're opportunities. And yeah, but I think the ability to take advantage of them is difficult in a world in which the response traditionally is to double down. So to create more free trade zones or to reinforce sovereignty. So it limits the way we can resist, but I think it does present opportunity.
So I want to draw the evening to a close. All your many questions are an indication of how interesting, how engaging the panel has been, how important the panel has been. I just want to remind you that, you know, it's so seldom in our lives that it's so clear to us that we're living through a moment of major historical shift. Normally these things we see in retrospect, but today, and maybe it's because things happen so fast in the modern world, we can actually see we're in the middle of a sea change that's changing the world. So we can watch it, I guess, and we can kind of sit in front of our TVs and watch the National and feel helpless. Or I think we can play our part, and many of you through your questions have exhibited that you are playing your part. You're activists and you're making your voices heard, and that's fantastic. I think all of us have a role to play in some way of supporting politically, writing letters to the editor, talking to our uncles and aunts and cousins who maybe not share our views, donating money, volunteering. You can respond in any way you want. I say just don't do nothing at all. Now, I know you'll want to join me in thanking the panelists for a fascinating evening and an important